Well, hey everybody, welcome back to Spartan Theology. Today I'm going to be talking with my buddy ceasetoknow. We've met in the Discord a few times, in a Discord. We've had a few discussions, and just making sure everyone can hear me. Yeah, okay. Just making sure my sound was good. But yeah, so we're going to be having a discussion mainly on morality. He's an atheist, obviously I'm a Christian. And I recently put out I was trying to do some stuff. I've been putting out a little bit of content on TikTok and was trying to have a discussion with some atheists there on morality, and it seemed like just a mess. And ceasetoknow noticed that, and he was willing to come on and have a conversation. So mainly the goal here is just kind of to really understand his view on morality and just see where it goes from there. I'm really just trying to understand the atheist point of view, and not that he speaks for all atheists, but just one atheist point of view, and we'll go from there. I'm sure it'll be a really good discussion. So with that, I'll bring in ceasetoknow, and cool. So nice to have you. I think I have you muted, but yeah, if you could just kind of introduce yourself a little bit, why you're interested in this topic, maybe, so people get a little view, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to talk. So obviously my interest is in philosophy. It's what I've been doing the majority of my life at this point. And I actually started out with an interest in morality. Since then, I've sort of ended up in other fields of interest, but my original focus was moral philosophy. And it's an issue that I think people on both sides of the conversation, whether religious or atheist, often get wrong. I've talked to a lot of atheists that really sort of struggle with, narrowing down why it is that they believe in morality. Oftentimes, the word subjective gets thrown around a lot. I think my perspective is one that I think can really ground moral truth outside of any kind of religious context. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, cool. I was just making sure the sound was working for everybody. But yeah, cool. So I'm looking forward to this. Yeah, so I guess the best way to start this off is so I asked a question on TikTok and put it out there. The question was, does evil exist? Which essentially just says, is there a real right and wrong out there that we can, and whether or not we can know what it is or not, that's a separate question, I guess. But is there a real right and wrong out there? So, as an atheist, what do you think about that? Obviously, as a Christian, I would say definitely there is, but just kind of one question at a time. Yeah.
Well, I think there is too. I think there's a lot of confusion about terms for a lot of people, the relationship, for example, between subjective and objective, the difference between subjective and relative. There's a lot of baggage that comes with these words that I think people are confused about. From my perspective, I don't know how familiar you are with Tim Harris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little bit. I haven't really read too much of his stuff, but I know he does believe in objective morality. And
I share some similarities with his approach, although I wish that in his book he had addressed more specifically particular schools of moral philosophy rather than just generally what people who are outside the field tend to think about these things. I will say that a lot of people that have tried to criticize Harris's point of view don't actually understand it, and don't, they strawman him all day. And I've realized the same thing with me as well. There's a failure of understanding the role of language and how that plays into this conversation. From my perspective, it's really not that difficult. The only thing that you need to ground morality and to understand why something like evil exists or why something like well-being exists, and is to one, acknowledge that consciousness exists, and two, acknowledge that consciousness has a nature. It's not arbitrary. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of culture. There's a nature that can be discovered through science and phenomenology and philosophy, and so starting point is consciousness, and then we look at, well, what are states of consciousness, and how do they relate to the moral question? Well, I think if you examine conversations about morality, you'll see that there's, at least in part, a concern for well-being and for suffering. Now, some schools of thought are more focused on the consequences of behavior, while others are more concerned with the intention behind the behavior. But suffering and well-being are always in the mix of the conversation. They're always a focus. So if I, for example, if I believe that I have a higher moral concern for a fellow human being than I do for an ant, that's because I think that an ant doesn't have the same ability to suffer the way that a human being can. Now, something that should be easy to recognize there is that that's something I could be wrong about objectively. If I'm wrong about the neurology of ants, then I would be getting that question wrong objectively. And a lot of the sort of backlash from other people in philosophy or from religious people has been that while science can tell us how to reach a certain goal, it can't tell us why we ought to want that goal. So there's something in philosophy called the is-ought distinction, which arose from David Hume, and he's basically saying that there is one way of talking about things that is descriptive. So we use science to describe nature, and then when we're talking about ought, it's sort of we're playing a different language game, sort of. Now, my interpretation of Hume is a bit different. I think a lot of people have actually misunderstood what he was trying to say when he was talking about morality. He wasn't including in the is human psychology. He was sort of making this strange distinction between the reality and then there's us. But even if you were to take the sort of the most common interpretation of his work, I think it shouldn't be that hard to see that there's a failure of language there, because one, science has always been interested in values. There's not this clear distinction between the two things. Science values logical coherency. It values logical consistency. It values certain kind of evidence. It values the method it uses. But that value is not self-justifying in the way that people seem to think that morality needs to be. Nothing is, any sort of field of knowledge or any approach to philosophy, science, or religion depends on certain axioms. Even logic depends on a certain axiom. What evidence can you use to convince somebody who doesn't value evidence? What logic can you give somebody who doesn't value logic? So the fact that it's axiomatic to begin with, as all things are, is not a defeater. It's what you have to sort of acknowledge in order to move forward in any kind of discourse, intellectual and otherwise. Stop me at any point, by the way.
Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah, so basically I'm just trying to like really understand this. So you're just basically saying that like objectively we should shoot for the whatever being has the we should shoot for the goal of the most consciousness having the most well-being is essentially like boiled down, simplified way of like what you're kind of like a summary of your moral perspective. Essentially, if something has more consciousness or a higher level or more, however you want to put that, whatever. I mean, I think that makes perfect sense. Like an ant most likely has less, but it is interesting. Like you said, you could be objectively wrong about that if come to find out, we find out that ants are actually way smarter than people or whatever, or more consciousness, whatever that, more suffering, which would lead to more suffering when bad things happen to them.
And that's not to say that we don't have a moral responsibility towards animals, which have, I think.
Yeah, and they're saying in the chat you're really low. I don't know if you can turn your mic up. I can hear you just fine, but I don't know if.
Can you hear me better?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. They're just saying in the chat that you're really low, and you didn't seem to get much louder. I don't know if I can turn you up in StreamYard. It should be. I don't know. Maynard saves. I don't know if it's like really quiet where you can't hear him at all, or.
I moved closer to the microphone.
Yeah. Is it getting any better? And nice to see you too. We got Maynard saves and Jonathan Dupuy in the chat. Yeah, it should be okay. But yeah, we can just keep going. If they really can't hear you, then they'll comment again. But
yeah, just let me know and I'll maybe figure something out. But no, it's obviously we still have a responsibility towards animals, just out of the fact that they also have the capacity to suffer. But it's really what it comes down to is states of consciousness. How do we figure out globally and individually how to maximize well-being while reducing suffering? Now, there may be some degree to which the two come into conflict. Like, I'm not claiming that my perspective is a blueprint to answer every moral question imaginable. Well, all I'm trying to do is to ground the conversation to show that at least these questions exist and the answers exist in principle. Whether or not we can figure them out in practice is a different issue. And there may be multiple ways of actually doing that. But a lot of the sort of backlash that I've heard against these arguments is that, one, why should we ought to care about well-being in the first place? Which to me always seemed like a completely nonsensical question. Because the term ought is always concerned with a certain goal in mind. It's like saying, well, if thirst or hunger is a state of being, well, why should we ought to care about feeding ourselves or drinking or surviving? Well, we ought to care about it because it is in our nature to. And now people would say that this is a naturalistic fallacy. Just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's valuable or desirable. But I would point out that even the term desirable and valuable are descriptive words that arise from consciousness doing a certain type of thing. So it's not the case that whatever will lead to well-being is going to be so radically different from person to person. It just is the case that people tend to get the question wrong because they have their own assumptions. And I'm trying to think of how to. Here's one way of breaking this down. I'm not saying that there's one way to reach well-being. There may well be a variety of ways, but that doesn't make morality subjective. It makes it doesn't make morality relative. It makes it sort of what Harris describes as a moral landscape. So you can have a variety of foods that people might want to eat, and for some they might not like some, and they might like others. But objectively, there's still a difference between food and poison. So the variety of something is not the same thing as the concept being vacuous. It's not that now food is not a concept that can be understood, just because there's many different kinds. Really, what I think is meant by objective is the collective totality of subjective experience.
Okay, yeah, I want to understand that. So let's, really. So you're saying the nature. So yeah. So what do you think it means? Yeah, that's. I guess if we can I think this is where you're going, and just to clear this up. So what do you think the difference between that people are getting wrong about this question, objective versus subjective? I guess that's a big issue, because I think you would probably say some people that think they affirm subjective are just getting they're misunderstanding the point. I think is.
Well, they're misunderstanding the term, because when they use the word subjective, what they actually mean is relative. They're not the same thing. So here's what I mean by subjective. If you and I are standing, or if you and I are sitting at a table, and there's a glass on the table, now I'm having that experience subjectively of looking at the glass. you're having the experience subjectively of looking at the glass. But we're both looking at something objectively. There's something that we can communicate about there that is accessible to the both of us, that we can come to an understanding of. Everything is experienced subjectively. That doesn't mean that the nature of the experience is going to be so vastly different that there's no way for us to come to any kind of understanding of what we're saying. Or the term is just anything goes all of a sudden. That's not what is meant by subjective. So, an example that people often use as a way to sort of discredit my position is to say, well, what if a serial killer enjoys killing people, and that is the way for them to maximize their well-being? I understand the intuition there, but that is simply a lack of understanding of the psychology of serial killers, because a lot of research has been done on this. And when you actually examine who the types of people that these people are, they're not well-adjusted, happy individuals that are just going about their day. They're highly neurotic, victims of their own, what's the word I'm looking for? Victims of their own drives and needs that they have no control over. They have no ability to really have relationships with people, the type of relationships that we derive our meaning from to a large degree. They're essentially just reacting on impulse that they can't control. So, if that is not what I mean by well-being. I'm not talking about mere pleasure here. There's something deeper that I'm describing.
And it was, and I think you included like the whole everyone's subjective, so it's not really like the claim that one person gets well-being out of this, but it causes thousands of other people to have less well-being. Then obviously one person's relative or just opinion isn't what determines it.
Well, so yeah, it's also a sort of a totality of your relationship with the rest of society as well. But this idea, the other way that people attack my position is, well, how are you defining well-being? It's not, the fact that I don't have a clear definition is not really an issue either, because something like health is not clearly defined. What is thought to be what is the life expectancy now is far different than what it was 100 years ago. So health as a concept has developed. That doesn't make it vacuous. There are still things we can say objectively about it. So I wouldn't say, the difference between someone who's alive and a dead person is as objective as we get in science. And so a lot of these sort of responses, I think, are inadequate. I think actually miss the point. I think the more that we understand about philosophy of mind, the more we understand about neuroscience, the more the relationship between behavior and its consequences on the individual and on society as a whole will become clearer. So what is meant by evil? Well, whatever behavior is harming yourself and other people. Again, all you have to do is acknowledge that consciousness exists, acknowledge that consciousness has a nature, and then go about how do we uncover that nature. And once you understand that the language of ought has always been concerned with a goal in mind, then why should ought in the moral context suddenly have a special standard where now it's meaningless? We can't support it because it becomes arbitrary. No, it's all connected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is. So I'm trying to think. So basically the disconnect or the disagreement, Christians want to say, when they're using the moral argument, for example, like an apologetic type thing, they want to say that, you can't really have oughts because you can't have a objective moral standard, because it seems like morals is more of this concept, And for there to be like a objective concept out there, there has to be something grounding that. But essentially what you're saying is we're just grounding it in well-being of consciousness. And so to reach that goal of maximum well-being of consciousness, you ought to do whatever good thing to help people, essentially.
And to ask, is that goal good in itself, is to miss the point. Because language is descriptive in this context. It's like saying, is thirst, thirst? Is hunger, hunger? It's all pointing to a deeper principle. And the problem with the religious perspective is that, you run into the same problem of there is distinction in that context as well. Because I can throw the same question around to you, like, why should we ought to care about what God says is good? Why is that matter?
Yeah, and it really is essentially because there's a goal in mind of like getting to heaven or whatever, just to simplify it.
It's still well-being, and just in that context, it's well-being for eternity, or well-being as. So really, the way that I sort of show why it can't be dependent on religion is because if you want to say that goodness is dependent on commandment, then that's arbitrary. Because if God decides all of a sudden that rape is good, and He is the highest power, then that would make rape good. Now, if you want to say that God wouldn't say that, because it is fundamentally, goodness is an attribute of God, of His nature, and rape by definition.
Yeah, that's what I would say essentially. So
fair, but in that moment, you've already lost the debate, so to speak, because now you're talking about nature as well. Now you're saying that goodness is an attribute of God, but it's not. It's not synonymous to God, even if God had created the nature from which we understand goodness to be. Well, now we're just looking at the same thing. Now we're back at consciousness. We're back at nature. So really, what I'm doing is I'm making one less assumption. I see no reason to assume that goodness comes from God because I see no evidence for God, so I don't believe in that to begin with. But my lack of belief in God as a foundation doesn't leave me without a foundation, because all I have to do is look at consciousness, look at nature. This is psychology. This is how it is grounded.
Yeah. So let's make so basically, like, as far as, it's really not that much different, essentially. Like, we're both looking at well-being. It's just what determines that, like, to me, God determines what equals well-being. You know what I mean? Like, He set up the world in a way where being nice to one another helps us, as opposed to killing, whatever, that's the way I think about it. But essentially, like, thinking about morality can't really get us to that next, what you're saying, and I think I might agree with this too, that, like, really we can't get to that next step, like, to God. We both just get to what well-being is well-being, and we want to shoot for that, obviously, because our nature, like, drives us to shoot to that, to be comfortable or good things. It's not. There's really no way to take that next step to God using morality, and I could see that for sure. We both basically have the same goal in mind, so I don't know. And maybe there's a few different things, like I think you should pray or whatnot, but that's random, like, secondary, moral normative claims or whatever. I'm bad with the terms, but that's down the road or whatever. That's not ontology.
The goal, I think, is the same, but the belief in what will constitute that goal, like how we will reach that goal, varies greatly among cultures and individuals. But that's not because the issue is an objective. It's because people are confused. What do you say? They're confused by. We don't know that well what will help us reach the goal that we want. Now, when it comes to extremes, we do. Because I don't think that you need a degree in neuroscience to know that rape is bad. That's easily observable even without looking at the brain, just in terms of experience and psychology, and looking at how it affects both the person doing it and the victim. nobody is actually benefiting. I mean, to some degree, some of my intuitions, I think, are on the Buddhist perspective, where I do believe that if you're hurting somebody else, you're ultimately also hurting yourself. And again, I see that as a feature of consciousness. And there's a lot, I think, when people say, well, how do you prove that? Again, I would point to a lot of what's been done in the past century, both in neuroscience and in psychology. And also just common sense,
Yeah. I mean, there's
the experience of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just getting like into the nitty-gritty or whatever, like individual moral claims, like what actually is good or best or whatever. And that's epistemology, where that's completely different than whether or not it exists out there. There is a right or wrong. Whether or not we know or we can figure it out easily or we struggle to figure out what it is, like that's kind of irrelevant.
Well, it's a separate question. That's more of an issue of how do we set this up in practice?
Mm-hmm.
How do we go about discovering this stuff? But so one example that I've used, or I think I've heard used somewhere, is right now there is a specific number of elephants that exist in the world. How many are there? Well, that question has an answer in principle. Even if I can't actually give you an answer, like I have no way of actually knowing how many there are, doesn't take anything away from the fact that in principle, the answer is there. And I would say the same thing about morality. Whether or not, to what degree we can uncover enough of a consciousness to come to a larger understanding of these issues is an open question. But that I think morality can be grounded in something beyond pure relativity or religion because God says so, I think is pretty clear. And I think there's a millennia of moral philosophy that points to that. So for me, it's, I don't take seriously, the religious perspective that says that as an atheist, you have no grounding for morality. And if you believe in morality, it's because you're actually getting it from God. Like the idea that our values are Christian values. Certainly Christianity encompasses our intuitions. But the golden rule existed in Chinese philosophy before and after Christianity.
No, I
We wouldn't have made it this far as a species if everybody thought from day one that we should all kill each other without any sort of, maybe it started off as just a tribe against tribe and then expanded over time. But then there was some intuition of how to organize, even at a smaller level, that would have had to be there for us to make it this far.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm trying to think like what exactly. So when someone brings up, as far as, because to me, I don't know exactly where I want to go here. Sorry, I'm like taking everything in you're saying and like. But
I'm throwing a lot at you.
Yeah, and I struggle. The one thing I struggle with your point of view, and I don't want to get too far into this, and this is just like something that doesn't leave my brain or whatever, but it's just how like free will plays into this though, because like I don't understand how you can say like something. I guess you could say something could be wrong. That's fine. I just don't really see how you can like have any sort of ought if no one has the ability really to make a choice. Like. You're just going to do, unless you're just saying ought in a sense that you ought to do this, but it doesn't, I guess to me, ought implies a choice, but I guess it doesn't have to. I guess that.
No, it doesn't have to. I'm on the issue of free will, I'm a little bit more uncertain. Like if there's any position that I wish was true, that you could accuse me of having wishful thinking, is towards the notion that free will exists. But I've spent the last 17 years trying to find it unsuccessfully. Now, yes, what we would normally consider as moral responsibility without free will doesn't really work the same way. That's not to say that, free will, well-being and everything I've just described still can exist. I don't choose my consciousness in its state.
Mm-hmm.
So my lack of free will doesn't negate morality in the context in which I've just described it. It does result in us having to sort of shift our intuitions as to what we mean and how we view people that do evil or good. Even if I was to believe that a serial killer ultimately might not be responsible for their actions, it doesn't mean that I'm just going to be okay with them going out and killing people. Ultimately, I have to protect myself.
No, for sure.
So regardless, our concern is still going to remain the same. I'm on that question. I'm a lot more agnostic, I think, as to how one would. And again, I think a lot of people also make the assumption that without free will, then minds can't be changed, or we're just one way our whole lives.
Yeah, no,
That's not really what it is.
No, I mean, obviously, we know how people work. Like, we know we can change people's minds. It's just whether or not, like, they had any choice in that or not. But, I mean, that is really irrelevant. You could be obviously, you could be happy without free will. I mean, that doesn't, you can be suffering without free will. You didn't have to make a choice. So, to aim towards well-being doesn't require free will. It's just the whole, like, morality. I think one part of it is, like, blame and praise, like being able to, like, I guess I don't know if like moral blame is essentially the same as morality, but in my head it is. And like, if you can't really blame somebody, or if somebody's not really responsible for what they do, that's where I struggle to see that real morality. And it's not objective morality. I think people just, there's these terms and they'll just want to say, if you don't hold to this like Christian view, you don't hold to objective morality, and that's fine. Like, you can easily hold to objective. Like, there's a objectively right way to increase well-being, and there's an objective way that you are hurting conscious beings. That's objectively bad. Mm-hmm. There's no issue there. But it's as far as like I would say, just for sake of argument, if God does exist and free will exists, like he can hold you to an objective standard, or hold you to a responsibility for what you've done, more than under the assumption that God doesn't exist, and we're just like, if that outside thing to me gives like a morality and another layer of responsibility or whatnot.
I don't think I don't fully agree with that, because even if there isn't a consciousness to set this in place, if nature is what it is, then I'm ultimately going to suffer regardless. So the consequence is there either way. I think with the God question, my concern is, that one, if it is based on commandments, that to me is no different than a dictatorship. That's just like power equals, or might equals rights. That to me can't be a moral system. And
you weren't in the camera.
Yeah, I just don't. I don't see that as it doesn't really explain things the same way, as far as I'm concerned. It's an extra assumption that I think is unnecessary. You don't need to make it, and I think without it, you don't lose anything, except maybe with the free will aspect of it. But you could have free will and there not be a God. So free will doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily dependent on God either.
So I'm just thinking. I'm thinking. So on like my perspective. So on your view, say something. So something is only immoral if it harms well-being. So say like stealing, for example, or whatever. That's immoral because it hurts someone. But if you steal something and they never know about it, would that still be immoral?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple questions, a couple ways to answer that. One is, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for context. So, for example, if you're stealing to feed your family, you're not going to see that person as being equally immoral as someone stealing for the pleasure of it. In the grand scheme of things, you could still see both as immoral. There may be other alternatives, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other, stealing or not stealing. But there is some context there. But with the question you just asked, with someone finding out, that's what I think Kant is talking about, the moral rule, the moral law. Imagine if everybody stole, then society would collapse. If obviously, killing is a little bit different because the person would be a victim of that.
Yeah, but that's kind of like virtue ethics or whatever. Is that like the term I'm looking for?
There's a way in which, well, it's more like rule consequentialism, where when you sort of globalize the behavior, even if maybe in the instance of the individual nobody might be affected, the consequences of adopting that as a moral action or an okay action has higher implications. And I'll just add one other thing. What I mean by well-being is not mere pleasure. Because one argument that I've heard is, well, what if we could build a machine that simulates the type of life that you would want to live that would give you the most well-being, but it's not real, it's a simulation. Well, most people wouldn't want to get into the machine. But under what I'm saying, it would sound as though they should. But I do think that that's sort of a little bit of a confusion too, because we still, we have a drive and an intuition towards wanting our meaning and our experience to be real. And so I'm not talking about, sorry, say?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, like, you wouldn't have real effects on, like, other people either in that scenario. So, and that could be a part of well-being, like, could be really helping other people would increase your well-being, and helping robots or simulations isn't the same.
Right, and again, and this is going back to, I think, what people misunderstand about the naturalistic fallacy, which they accuse my position of taking, which is, I'm not saying that just because something is natural, it's valuable or desirable. I'm saying that those concepts themselves arise from phenomenology, which is sort of the field relating to consciousness experiencing itself, the structure of consciousness. All these things have a grounding in a nature, in principle. So it's not really a fallacy of the kind that they're pretending that it is. This is a confusion of language, which I don't know if I've really done a good enough job of really expressing why that is.
Yeah, maybe we could. Maybe we get in that a little bit.
Come back.
Yeah.
I'll come back another time if people are.
Yeah. I would like to. I got a buddy too, dry apologist, who is pretty into like the problem of evil and stuff. I think you and him could have a real good conversation. So that would be pretty cool, and that's kind of like an extension, of morality. I would say it kind of goes hand in hand for sure. Because I mean, if morality is subjective, then it's pretty hard to say evil exists or whatever. But I mean, I guess it's more of like an internal critique. But either way, we don't need to get into that right now.
I've never heard a response to the problem of evil from the theistic perspective that I have found satisfactory. Because even when the answer by saying, well, God gave us free will, and God will eventually punish it in the long term. Well, free will for who? Because the rape victim is having her free will taken advantage of. She has no say, or he has no say in what's taking place. And so God doesn't intervene in that circumstance, but he intervenes in the Old Testament when he's mad that people have been worshiping him incorrectly. So that doesn't resolve it for me either, because
I don't think the free will defense really that also doesn't address natural evil. It doesn't address like babies getting cancer. It doesn't. I mean, a baby gets cancer and dies when it's 3 months old, or didn't really have much free will in that decision. So I don't really see how free will defense can really apply there at all.
Yeah, and natural disasters and disease and all those kind of things. It's like, well, why would that? Who's gaining from that? And if God is all powerful and all loving, you wouldn't expect those things to take place. And so usually the response to that is, well, God is mysterious. Who are we to judge God's ways?
It's like
But
skeptical
that's an
theism.
evasion.
Yeah, I don't really. Yeah, so as far as my like best explanation, I'm not really sure. You know, I think I think the problem of evil is like the atheist's best objection, and that's something that I want to learn more about before I like really settle on what I think. But there's a few things. I mean, I think free will addresses a lot of things. I mean, a lot of moral evils. Like I think the ability to make a choice, for sure, plays into it, but doesn't explain everything at all. And I think part of it is like the way my buddy, dry apologist Caleb, he talked, and I'm kind of really on board with he came up with his own theodicy, and he calls it the perfect will theodicy. So essentially, God can't morally justify making a world in which there is no evil, because a world like that would be 100% in line with his nature. It would be no one would be able to make any decision that deviates from his nature, or else that would be bad. So he would be, in a sense, forcing beings into relationship with him, and God can't morally justify forcing someone into a relationship with him. So he essentially starts us out in this world that's not perfectly aligned with his nature in order to go ahead. Yeah, I'm curious what you think.
But the problem with that is, then how can he morally support the idea of then creating a hell for people to go to who don't want, or who like, how do I say this? If that's the case, then the notions of heaven and hell and eternal punishment.
Yeah, I don't believe in eternal conscious torment either, but I know a lot of Christians
but many Christians do.
Yeah, exactly. That's why.
Which I find to be contradictory to the nature of God as is described by Christians. And some people view hell not just the behaviors in the world, but simply your rejection of God or Jesus Christ itself as a claim, as a truth claim. But if I don't believe in God, it's not a choice I'm making. I don't choose what I find convincing. I just find convincing what I find convincing. So the idea that because of that, because it's not to works that I'm saved, but through grace and accepting Christ. So essentially, I'm going to be spending eternity in hell for being made in the nature that God made me. It's completely nonsensical.
Yeah, no, I pretty much agree with exactly what you said. I think it doesn't make any sense. Like when some atheists make the claim that like, oh, I go to hell because I used my brain. I mean, I think that's a ridiculous claim. That's not how I understand God. But I think under some Christians' view or whatever, that perfectly makes sense. Like you look into
reaction.
Yeah, you look into it too much and you get convinced that God doesn't exist or whatever, and then you go to hell. I don't think that's the way. I'm not exactly sure if I agree with like universalism or how all this works, but I know for a fact that no one dies and then it's like, damn, I made the wrong decision. You know, there you are, and then they go to hell. That's not the way it works, and how that plays out, I'm not exactly sure.
But when atheists respond that way, they are responding to Christians that believe exactly that.
Oh, exactly.
And there's a lot of them. I mean, the amount of threats of hell that I get and that I see fellow atheists get on a daily basis, based on that interpretation, is ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't affect me because I think it's all bullshit. But it is something that I think is immoral about the ideology. And the other thing too is, you know, the Bible, I think, is inconsistent to some degree in its moral message. I mean, we don't have to get into all the details of that because you were asking more about my support of it. But just one reason why I don't buy more other notions of morality is, you know, one part in the Bible it talks about, you know, loving the other as yourself, and in the other it doesn't come out right and say slavery should be abolished. Now, yeah, of course there are passages that, you know, I'm not saying that it's, you know, but that's the point. There is a contradictory nature to things, and you know, we couldn't live if we, you know, based on Old Testament scripture in the 21st century. We would go to prison. So when you're reading the Bible and you read the part about stoning people for adultery, and you reject that as being outdated, and then you read the part of the Bible that talks about the golden rule, and you take that as a moral lesson worthy of following, that the morality there didn't come from the book, it came from your brain. So there's just a confusion about the sources here. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And I think, like, I don't know, there's a ton to get into. I think getting deeper into theology and further understanding the role of the Old Testament and the role of the law. Like, there's so much into this. Yeah, I don't want to get into, like, slavery in the Old Testament or anything. But I totally agree. Like, I think to say that if a Christian says, like, oh, the only way you can have morality is if you believe in the Bible, and then you look at that Christian and you say, well, the only reason you were able to even make the decision that stoning is bad and loving your neighbor is good is because of your moral intuitions or whatever, then obviously they're not getting their morality from the Bible either. So to say that you need to agree with the Bible to have morality it's contradictory. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, and I think if there's one point that I would like to get across to anyone listening to this right now is that the claim that, from my perspective, morality is an issue of opinion, is what I happen to choose is good as opposed to bad, you're just missing the point. It's not understanding that there's a nature to consciousness that is out of my control. I don't choose it. It just is, and it's there for discovery.
So that's what makes it objective. Yes, that there's this objective nature that one thing leads to it being better off, and one thing leads to it being worse off.
Yeah, and that is often the sort of response that I get from Christians or Muslims or any other religious group is that claim, is that you're that I'm arbitrarily deciding as would anybody else. And it's like, no, we have literally centuries of philosophy and neuroscience and psychology that tells us otherwise. Just a matter of people educating themselves on what the evidence is.
Yeah, so basically, so I feel like I actually understand it a little better, because essentially your view is really the whole subjective, objective, like, I agree, like, I understand now what you mean by that just misses the point, for sure, because...
And it misses the relationship between the terms. It objective and subjective, the objective is what the subjective experiences in the totality and globally. So there's a confusion of terms, and I think the problem is that a lot of people talk about things without really having the background necessary to understand what these words mean. And it takes a long time to really understand those things. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years, and there's still a lot of times where I sort of get stuck and I'm unsure, what I'm doing. So I think people will benefit from more humility on all sides.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree, for sure. And that's why I think something like this is awesome, because I think the only way to even have this conversation, like, for someone, it blows my mind that there can be like because, I guess I have like an apologetics channel or whatever, but I struggle more and more to associate myself with a lot of Christian apologists. And for someone to say that like they argue the moral argument or whatever, but they have never had a conversation like this, then they obviously don't understand the other person's point of view. And to say that, oh, you can't have objective morality is like me telling you that you can't objectively say that eating food stops you from being hungry. And like that is a ridiculous claim.
Yeah, and in general, I have very little, again, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but my respect for apologetics is almost non-existent. I consider it to be pseudo-philosophy at its worst. And maybe I can come back another time and go over why that is in more detail. But I think this is a little bit out of topic, but one of the core sort of claims from apologetics is that my ability to use reason and logic in the first place only makes sense in the context of God. Nobody finds that convincing except for apologists. You say that in any sort of 101 introduction to philosophy class in epistemology, they'll literally laugh. There's so much wrong with that statement, but people say it as though it's a matter of fact. it drives me crazy. Maybe we can have that conversation later down the line, but yeah, it's confusion of terms and relations, and hopefully I've done a little bit of a better job at clarifying some of this.
Yeah, I feel like you have. I feel like you have for sure. I feel like going into a conversation, I have a little bit different view, and I do feel like I understand it a little better. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'd love to have you on more for sure. You're definitely yeah, you're able to have a good conversation. You know what you're talking about. I wish I knew a little more about like philosophy. I've been doing like actual philosophy for like a year, so I got a little ways to go before I understand all these terms.
Yeah,
I've actually
read
Hume.
I can recommend you some books.
Okay.
I can recommend you some sources and things to look at.
Yeah.
I really believe that fundamentally most confusions about reality come to a confusion about language. Most differences in philosophy and assumptions and all these things come from a confusion about language and to what degree language captures reality and to what degree it fails to do so.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's another thing, like I've noticed, the more and more I have these conversations, obviously we disagree, but a lot of the disagreement can get cleared up with a conversation, actually listening to what the other person has to say. When I hear some of these conversations, I'm just like, oh my gosh, you people are not hearing each other. Most debates are talking past each other, for sure.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. And, when I try to debate somebody, I try to really go in it with the best intentions. It's just that a lot of times people talk about things that they don't have an actual grasp of. I mean, the amount of times that I've heard people say, again, this is out of the topic, but that evolution is a problem for the naturalistic perspective. I mean, it's just insanity. It's just not at all true. And the same thing with morality, that you can only have a grounding if you follow this book. Well, you've ignored literally millennia of philosophy there. You can only believe that if you haven't really done the work in the history of these conversations. Mm-hmm. And there's a long history. So I don't know. I think some philosophical damage has been done because of the whole is-ought distinction and confusion about that. That many atheists don't understand how to defend themselves in this conversation either.
Oh yeah, for sure. The other most people I talk to like on TikTok or whatever, like they just said ridiculous claims. Like, oh, it's just like it is. They act like it's so simple to just say that morality is just subjective based on whatever, and like they just have no issue with this. And I'm just like, we walk out in the world, like it is obvious that there is an ought, that you ought to not just walk up to the most random old lady and slap her in the face. Like it is obvious that causes damage to society, causes damage to yourself, it causes damage to her. So to claim that there's no grounding, I think an atheist can easily say, like, look, like that is a bad thing, and nobody wins in that. So whether or not, like, in the grand scheme of things, like ultimately that's like good is where I think the atheist can't say. But I don't think that plays into anything. Like that's another level that it has no effect on our actual, like if God doesn't exist, then that ultimate good that I think does matter, like that maybe it's not there. So whether or not that's there, we can't see that in reality. I don't know if I'm making exactly
you are.
Yeah, I'm trying to word my point a little bit, but I think the difference between the theist and the atheist is like a level above what we experience, really, and it really doesn't the argument, I think I could see how it doesn't. I mean, it's crazy though, because I think the way the argument does work, and so it's just like as far as blameworthiness, like are you truly blameworthiness? And I could see how that, maybe if I've understood a little bit, and maybe it doesn't, but that's like where my head's going, that you really can't say under an atheist view that someone is like ultimately to blame, that person. But I guess Yeah.
But you can say they're evil.
Yes.
So there is some
Yes.
tension with the blame, but you can say they're evil. And really, with the Christian worldview, what you're doing is sort of moving the goalposts a little farther down, where now well-being is not just dependent on this life, it becomes dependent eternally or in some other life. But again, that may be true or false, but it doesn't undermine well-being in this life.
Yes.
And what constitutes it in this.
Yeah, totally agree there. So basically, like, when I like became a Christian, it was like when someone says they were like felt convicted of their sin or whatnot, like I could see how that doesn't, like, I think that still makes sense on a Christian worldview to say like that led me towards looking for answers and I couldn't find an answer in atheism. I hate to say it like that, but I think you know what I mean, and I'm not trying to like strawman atheism like it's a worldview or anything, but without God, there really couldn't be that ultimate blame. Like, once I die, it's over. But that's irrelevant to, like, if you don't feel that way, if you don't feel that that's relevant to you, then I can't really convince you that it is, because...
Right.
But if I feel I guess I was just kind of, like, so I think the argument, like, a Christian can be convinced that, like, their wrongdoings have another meaning that can't be satisfied in this life or whatever, but to prove that is impossible. So
and from my perspective, it's not really relevant whether or not there's an afterlife. I care about the well-being in this life. So if caring about that will, as a consequence, lead me to eternal well-being or eternal suffering, it's not, that's besides the point. All I can know is what is true in this life.
And as far as morality in this life, there's really no argument that says like an atheist can't hold to the same essentially standard that everyone else holds to. There's no real God doesn't do something that an atheist can't do under their worldview.
And it's a mistake to assume that those principles are Christian, because those principles have existed outside of before and after, independent of Christianity. And one thing that I see is people blame atheism for, like Hitler or Stalin or sort of the atrocities that those people committed. I mean, aside from the fact that Hitler mentions God in his writing often, but the other examples, a lot of those were essentially political religions. They weren't motivated to do evil because of atheism. Atheism itself is just a rejection of a claim. It's amoral. You matter what else you believe about it. I'm an atheist and I'm a humanist, a naturalist. So it's not, my morality is not atheism per se, just the other philosophical ideas that go along with it. So, for someone like Stalin, he was driven by power to do evil, not driven by, there is no God, so I may as well just kill everybody. Like, that's not, it's a false accusation and just a misunderstanding of history that I run into constantly.
I think that claim is ridiculous too. I don't really.
But people make it all the time.
No,
and,
I know.
And I wouldn't blame, for example, all religious people for evil done in the name of religion. Now, there are circumstances in which I would, where I do think that belief in a particular doctrine or in a particular interpretation of a doctrine can lead to immorality. But whether or not someone's using that as an excuse for something they would already do, or whether or not they don't, is an open question. I think it matters on the individual. But you don't have the same connection with atheism because atheism doesn't have a book that is a guide of any sort. So it's just a bad analogy. Yeah.
Well, I think we made some progress here for sure. This was a good conversation. We're right at an hour, and I know if it gets too much longer, nobody's going to watch it.
Sure.
So, yeah, I really
Thanks
appreciate
again for having me.
Yeah. And we'll definitely have ceasetoknow on some more. So if you guys enjoyed this, for sure, anybody wants to have a conversation with you, they probably can either join the Discord or get in touch with you somehow, for sure. You seem like you're pretty open to having a lot of conversations. I think it looked like they were talking about you're going to be debating Gavin at some point soon. I don't know.
I'm open to whatever. I'm
Yeah.
just waiting for.
Okay. Well, Gavin was in the chat here or whatever, and I saw them talking about it, so that's the only reason
Yeah,
I brought it
I'd
up.
be happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. Well, I guess we'll end it here and call
Thanks
it
again.
that. I hope everybody that listened to this learned a little bit. I know I did. So, yeah. Like I said.
Yeah, I hope I was clear and everybody could hear me.
Yeah, I think I got it turned up. I think part of it was me at it a little low. I don't know what it is, but it seemed like it got better. So I really appreciate you coming by and